Hi, it's Emily Leapart here, welcoming you to the Canadian Adventure YouTube Hop. My crafty friends and I will be showing you how we used the new O Canada bundle that's part of the Global Adventure Portrait collection from Catherine Pooler Designs. This hop gives you the chance to win a $50 gift certificate to the Catherine Pooler shop, so be sure to subscribe and leave a comment at all stops. The more you comment, the higher your chances of winning. I made 3 cards featuring products from the O Canada bundle, and I've barely made a dent in all that's possible. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use all of the products included in this fun bundle, but let's start with a closer look at the stamps, dies, stencil, patterned paper, and sequins. The main stamp set is called O Canada, and the solid layering stamps are absolutely adorable. My first love is the Derpy Beaver, of course. If you don't already know the story, my family is very fond of beavers. Ever since my husband adopted the persona of a beaver from the Minecraft game, my son and I have called him Bucky. This stamp set comes with coordinating dies which are a must-have, so you can mix and match the images and create tons of scenes. Next up is the Forever Maple stencil and Forever Maple dies. This is actually one large die and is not meant to be cut apart. If you feel like you might cut these apart by accident, write yourself a note on the back. I'll be showing you how they line up and how you use this unique die to cut out your stenciled leaves. The added details on the die cuts are amazing. The colors in the Moose Crossing paper pack are so pretty, and I featured 5 of the 8 designs on my 3 cards. Lastly, this bundle includes the Yukon sequin mix, and the sequins coordinate nicely with the patterned papers. My color palette for this video includes all of the colors featured in the Moose Crossing paper pack, plus a few more. The main colors are Rockin' Red, Cranberry Fizz, Glitz, Grass Skirt, Deck the Halls, Something Borrowed, Dress Blues, Over Coffee, and S'mores. I'm going to start by showing you how I stamped all of the images in the O Canada stamp set. I love ombre stamped solid images, which gives them some depth and dimension. I used Grass Skirt and Deck the Halls to stamp the trees. I used a sponge dauber to soften the lines between the 2 colors. Sometimes I stamped it twice, often by recreating the ombre effect, but often I just used the lighter color the second time. The last few times I only used a single layer of ink for a more impressionist effect, and actually ended up using those trees because they had a more textured look. Regardless, all versions look great, and any leftovers will be used on future cards. Next, I use a small acrylic block to stamp lots of tree trunks in S'mores ink, and I did this because I planned to create a hockey net with them, but didn't end up doing it for this video. If you didn't see the cute Instagram reel I posted yesterday, you'll have to check it out so you can see where the idea came from. I may still make a card in that fashion and post it. I stamped several of the small maple leaves in both Rockin' Red and Cranberry Fizz. I ombre stamped a couple of them without using a sponge dauber, and those turned out to be my least favorite. So the key is to use a sponge dauber or a Catherine Pooler blending brush, which works equally well. While I was using Glitz to stamp the maple syrup bottles, I realized I needed to re-ink it, so I thought I'd show you how I re-ink my pads. I've done this in many different ways over the years, but this works the best for me. I place my ink down in a circular motion and then take Ranger's Craft Squeegee, which is rubbery and flexible. It won't scrape or damage the surface of the ink pad. I press the edge down and run it back and forth across the ink pad, which pushes the ink down into the pad very evenly. You can add more ink and do this a second time too, until you get the perfect saturation, but you definitely want to try stamping with it before you add more ink. For the Mountie hat, I stamped the first one using Over Coffee for the hat itself and S'mores for the band. This first color combo is the same color as what the RCMP wear, but I also wanted to stamp some red ones using Cranberry Fizz and S'mores. Next, I'll ombre stamp the Moose Mug with Something Borrowed and Dress Blues using a sponge dauber to blur the transition. After that, I'll stamp a bunch of the hockey pucks using Blackjack ink. For the hockey sticks, I used Sandcastle, Over Coffee, Something Borrowed, and Dress Blues. One of the hockey sticks and all of the pucks are featured in the Instagram reel I mentioned earlier. The hockey skates are super fun to stamp, especially if you mask off the blade to create realistic skates. For the first pair, I used a post-it note to mask off the boot and stamped the blade with Twilight. Then I moved the post-it note to cover the blade and stamped the boot and blackjack. I do this again by flipping the cardstock panel. For the second pair of skates, I used the same technique but used grass skirt and deck the halls to create an ombre effect, same as the trees I stamped at the start of this video. I saved the best for last, and of course it's the beaver. I stamped the entire image first with over coffee, and after carefully cutting a curve from a couple of sheets of post-it notes, I placed the mask and stamped the tail again with s'mores ink. This gives the beaver its 2 shades of brown and makes him look more realistic. I used 2 sheets of post-it notes because the mask doesn't work well after it gets soaked with ink. Finally, I stamped the beaver's face using black ink. With the first 2 stampings inside the MISTI, I placed the face too low, which resulted in one tooth showing above the muzzle. Even after switching to the acrylic block and eyeballing it from overhead, I was only able to get one of them stamped perfectly. I didn't want to have to restamp all the beavers and start over, so here's my quick fix. I used a dampened paintbrush and dipped it in over coffee ink to lightly fill in the white section above the muzzle line. As you can see, this solves my poor stamping very efficiently, and once it dries, you can't even tell that I made a mistake. Now for the Forever Maple stencil and dies. You will see the name of the stencil and Catherine Pooler's website etched at the bottom of the stencil. You'll position this at the bottom. Once you've matched up the dies to the stencil, you'll want to make note of its direction as well, so next time you won't have to reposition it. You can use a Sharpie directly on the back of the die, or use a label like I have here. I used 2 arrows to show me the bottom of the die with respect to the bottom of the stencil. Now it's time to get inky. I'm using Glitz, Rockin' Red, and Cranberry Fizz, working in that order which is lightest to darkest. I'm going to color the tips of the leaves with Glitz and work my way to the stems with Cranberry Fizz. The stencil looks super messy and my fingers were covered in ink, but the stencil cleaned off like new. I decided to ink up the stencil a second time, but with a lighter hand, and you can see the difference between the two. In order to line up the die with the stenciled leaves, I cut the leaves from a sheet of vellum. Then I used temporary glue tape to attach those negative pieces to the stenciled panel. Once I place the die on top, the raised vellum leaves will lock the die in place. I hold it in place with removable tape and run it through my die cutting machine. After I separate the vellum from the die cuts, I take an adhesive remover to clear up any sticky residue. One other thing you can do with a stencil is to dry emboss with it, and this is one of my favorite things to add versatility to your stencils. First, cut your panel to size, then use a distress spray bottle to lightly mist it. I usually use 3 pumps from about 8 to 10 inches away. Then I use my hand to spread the water evenly across the panel. You'll have to check your own die cutting machine's directions for dry embossing, but in the Spellbinders Platinum 6, I place the stencil directly onto the cutting platform without a base plate, with the damp cardstock on top. Then I place the embossing mat on top of that, which will push the cardstock into the stencil with the pressure of the added embossing plate. I just love the subtle texture it gives to the cardstock. Now it's time to assemble my cards. The first card features this embossed panel, as well as 2 sheets of patterned paper cut from the Moose Crossing paper pack. I used 2 of the melon edge dies to create these shapes. I basically used these colors to mimic water and sunlight. I used liquid glue to attach these panels directly onto the embossed panel. Then I couldn't bear the thought of covering up the beaver's adorable ears, so I had to try and cut a slit into the hat and have the ears peek out. Anyway, I couldn't decide if it looked good and ended up tearing the hat, so I had to stamp a whole new one. I ended up keeping it simple and gluing it to the beaver's head as is. I wanted to keep the sentiments super simple, so I did some stamp surgery instead of getting out the original Misty and masking off the A. Yes, that is a scary thought to many, but if it makes life easier, then don't be afraid to cut up your sentiments. You can always use them in their original format another time. After attaching the panel to the card base, I popped up the beaver in foam tape and added some Yukon sequins. I felt that the corners were too harsh, so I used a corner chomper to round off the upper right hand corner, and now this card is done. For my second card, I also used an older but new to me set called Snow Globe Adventure. I love snow globes and mountains, so this set pretty much has everything to create the perfect day or night scene. I've pre-cut the wood grain paper and forest background from the Moose Crossing paper pack. I also stamped the snow globe itself with Deck the Halls ink and die cut it using the coordinating dies. The moon itself was stamped in twilight and the stars in glitz. Small trees were also ombre stamped with grass skirt and Deck the Halls just like the large trees from the O Canada stamp set. I decided to white heat emboss the sentiment that reads "Adventure Awaits" directly onto the snow globe. Once again, I used liquid glue to attach all of the panels directly to the card base. I also attached a vellum panel in front of the forest pattern because it's too busy and would distract from the other elements. After allowing it to dry, I added the water strip and popped up the large trees and beaver from O Canada. I love that the beaver is holding one of the smaller trees. Finally, I glue on the moon and stars and add some glue dots underneath the tree trunks. Now this card is done. This is my husband's favorite of the bunch. For my last card, I used the largest of the scallops and dots dies to cut a panel from patterned paper. This design was inspired by Alina Krauss, and she uses it so well. I thought it would be a cute way to highlight the maple syrup bottles. After gluing the small maple leaves onto the bottles and arranging them with space for the sentiment, I white heat embossed one of the O Canada sentiments on black cardstock and die cut it using one of the Ex Libris dies. Then I glued the patterned paper to the card base and popped up all the elements on foam tape. I had a hard time deciding if the bottles should be underneath or on top of the sentiment panel, so I left them underneath. But now I feel like the one on the right should be on top. Here's a review of all three of my cards. I had so much fun creating with this adorable O Canada bundle, plus a few extras. All of the supplies are in the description below, and my blog always features a visual list if that's your preferred shopping style. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe for more inspiration. Your next stop is Karen Aiken, and you'll find the link to her video in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.